How many books do you read in a year? Yeah, they're a lot of fun.
Having done a couple of them, you're just like, oh, wow, people come out and they want to hear me talk about this thing I wrote.
There's nothing more satisfying as an author than talking to somebody who, read your book and I always am quick to say, hey, whether you loved it or hated it, I wanted to have a reaction, I think that's the most precious thing as an author is, takes an investment of time to read a book. My silver lining of COVID was it sort of afforded me the opportunity. I was working on a startup at the time. Partly because of the pandemic, we ended up pivoting and weren't able to raise more money. So we decided to, gracefully wind it down. And, I was already at home, sequestered, incomeless, halfway to being an author already. And so I thought, well, if I'm ever going to dive in and try this, now's a good time. 1,000 pieces of spaghetti are thrown against the wall and one or two stick, and those one or two are, Google or a Facebook or the next whatever. I mean, that's really the challenge and the promise of the venture-backed industry. So, my other rule in investing, most of what I do is friends and family type stuff. These are people that I know personally or have worked with in the past.
I'm Jarie Bolander, and welcome to the Entrepreneur Ethos Podcast. This podcast is all about how to build a more ethical, inclusive, and resilient world through educating and inspiring the next generation of entrepreneur through powerful storytelling. Let's get started. Mike Trigg, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. I mean, when Tabitha over at Bookspark says, you have to have Mike on your show, I do whatever Tabitha says.
Me too. We're both beholden to her.
And just a great team over there. Grace and Tabitha helped with doing the promotion of my book, Ride or Die. If, Booksparks helped you with your books.
Yep.
And I just can't say enough good things about Spark Press and Brooke and the whole team over there. So happy to have you on. But more importantly, what's super cool is you are an author, you're a former entrepreneur, and you're also an angel investor. And that is a rare combination.
That's a rare combination, especially when you give the caveat that I'm a fiction author.
Yes,
that crossover happens sometimes in nonfiction, but not as often in fiction. So
yeah. So this is going to be a fun conversation. I really appreciate you being on the show, and thanks Tabitha and team for hooking us up. But before we talk about your books and your entrepreneur journey and your angel investments, like I always like to say, why don't you tell us how you got to do what you're doing today?
Well, it was something I kind of always wanted to do. I remember in undergrad taking a creative writing course, and I was like, wow, I really enjoy this. And then shortly after that, I said, wow, you really can't make money doing this. So I pursued what I like to describe as writing adjacent things. I got into PR and marketing, which, involves a lot of writing, and you get compensated a little bit more than the average struggling author. And moved to Washington, D.C. I lived in D.C. for a number of years working on Capitol Hill. Then heard about this information superhighway thing, as we called it back in the early 90s, and got really intrigued by that. Came out to the Bay Area to go to business school at UC Berkeley and dove right into the dot-com boom. My first experience doing startups was in 98, 99 when things were just white hot, and have been in that space ever since. What got me into writing, though, as I mentioned, family, kids, a number of things intervened. But then about 5 or so years ago, I was like, I really want to write a novel. And I started, it kind of spawned out of dinner conversations at home with my wife after a long day at work. And I'd be sharing stories about just stuff that happened. And she would always sort of say, gosh, you should write some of this down. It's sort of interesting, funny. It's a window into how Silicon Valley tech culture and venture-backed startups work. And so I kind of had a set of anecdotes, and I was trying to weave it into a full-fledged novel, and just wasn't making a lot of progress. Having a family, doing a startup, and writing a book is sort of more than you can bite off. And my silver lining of COVID was it sort of afforded me the opportunity to I was working on a startup at the time. Partly because of the pandemic, we ended up pivoting and weren't able to raise more money. So we decided to, gracefully wind it down. And, I was already at home, sequestered, incomeless, halfway to being an author already. And so I thought, well, if I'm ever going to dive in and try this, now's a good time. So I did that in 21, got my first book called BitFlip, published in August of 22, as you mentioned, with Spark Press. And then have another book coming out in April. So just over 2 months away, or just under 2 months away, called Burner. So it's a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it. And that's how I got to what I'm doing today.
Yeah, I love the cover of BitFlip.
Yeah,
I know exactly where this is.
For anyone who's only listening, it's an iconic spot in San Francisco. It's called Christmas Tree Point. It's up. If you ever see that big, ugly TV tower that looks like the bow of a ship poking through the fog, it's up on the hill there. And the cover picture to BitFlip is looking back over the skyline of San Francisco. It's a beautiful shot. I actually went up there. I did a series of YouTube videos to promote the book. Mm-hmm. And I shot at different locations that have cameos in the book. And so my opening cameo is from that location.
Yeah, because Twin Peaks is there.
Twin Peaks is right there. Yeah.
I mean, exactly. when I used to ruck a lot and do all these adventure racing shenanigans, my route would be to go up there and go down there.
I'm impressed. That's a climb,
Yeah.
That climb through there.
It's no joke. It's no joke, especially with 40 pounds on your back like an idiot back then. Cool. Well, I mean, it's just so amazing, like that you found the bug to write, even given the technical, Silicon Valley and stuff. Because I have somewhat of a similar story. I have an engineering degree. When I was in engineering school, we had this thing called technical writing. Uh-huh. And they're like, yeah, take technical writing. Everyone's like, I hate this thing. This is the worst. And I'm like, God, this is really fun. This is kind of easy for me. And it sort of sat dormant for a long time until, I wrote a bunch of business books, and now I write business books, and I wrote the memoir with Spark Press, Spark Press. And yeah, just, you feel it in your bones.
Yeah.
It's like a calling.
It kind of is. I mean, I think that being a writer, people ask, do you have writer's block? And I honestly, I rarely have writer's block. I sometimes have editor's block, like once I write something, I sometimes have struggled to go back and edit it and revise it. But writing it does sort of feel like a calling. I mentioned before we got on air that my third novel I'm finishing up right now, and it just kind of spilled out of me. I had the idea, and unlike my second book, Burner, which is 3 narrators and it's a fractured time frame, and it just was really complicated to kind of bring all the pieces together. In this third book, it's a very concise 7-day, linear time frame, which sounds boring, but it's kind of the concept of like, the Kiefer Sutherland 24 series. It's like, you're on edge through the whole thing. And I think because of that anticipation, it was a really fun book to write. So
yeah. I've only written one novel with NaNoWriMo, never published it. It was just sort of a fun thing. Wanted to see if I could do 50,000 words in a month.
NaNoWriMo, for those who don't know, is National Novel Writing Month.
Yes, write a novel in a month.
In a month is the premise. I don't know that there are that many people who that is a heavy lift to get a novel written in a month, but you can get the framework of it certainly, and you can get, I think that's a good way to do it. A novel, like a business, especially a software business, you're creating something out of nothing. You really have to sort of forge the idea in your head. And I just find the faster you kind of get it out and get it on paper, or in the case of an app or a website or something like that, the faster you prototype it and get it online and start getting user feedback, that's what sort of, animates it. It makes it real. It gives it something that you can react to, that your readers and other users can react to. So, I think things like NaNoWriMo are good for that purpose, because it pushes you from concept in your brain to, all right, I've got something now, and I can sort of build on that and iterate on that.
For sure. I agree with that analogy too. The faster it gets out of your head on the page, or the faster the idea is in the world, it's just better.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I agree with you that there's definitely similarities between an author and an entrepreneur, and it's specifically if they're creating something from nothing. So
yeah,
I'm curious, how do you come up with your ideas on that? What's the spark?
Oh, wow. Well, so it's been a little different for each book. The spark for the first book was kind of, the old adage of write what you know. It's not a memoir. It's not autobiographical. It's completely fiction. And I'm always quick to emphasize that the people I actually worked with in my career were all wonderful. The people at this fictional company are a little less wonderful. But, what shifted that from anecdotes to an actual story was the hero's journey. This is sort of this narrative writing concept. If you're not familiar with it, you can look it up on Wikipedia, but it's, basically the hero gets cast from their regular world and they go on this adventure, and they often have to, it's against their will, and they meet a mentor. There's all these sort of stages. And once you learn it, you see it everywhere. Star Wars is a classic example of the hero's journey story template. And so I kind of grabbed onto that for a life buoy. I had, again, these sort of stories and characters and stuff in my head, but I didn't have, anything holding it all together. So that gave me the connective tissue to get it all down. So with the first novel, the inspiration was really, my life, my career, the characters not dissimilar to me. The second story, the inspiration, believe it or not, was the January 6th Capitol riot. Yeah. I mentioned I spent the early part of my career on Capitol Hill. This was in 1994. So it was a very interesting and fraught time. That was, I'm remembering all my history correct, the Oklahoma City bombing happened then, the anthrax mailings happened then.
Yep.
So there was very strong anti-government sentiment that was bubbling over in 92, 93, 94. Mm-hmm. And, we've sort of seen that extrapolate to present day.
Right.
And, I remember, you remember the guy with the antlers who was storming the Capitol and the face paint and whatnot. I sort of had this moment of like, well, what's that guy's backstory?
Right.
And so the story ended up being this kid who grows up, Shane, who grows up poor in the Central Valley, loses his parents, foster system, that whole thing, and sort of becomes an online savant and ends up creating this populist movement, alt-right movement, whatever you want to call it, that, gives him agency and a sense of power and purpose, but kind of starts to spin out of his own control. And he ends up meeting and falling in love with a woman who is the daughter of a tech billionaire and an Instagram celebrity, a progressive philanthropic person. Nobody knows that they're dating. And so the opening scene of the book, I wanted to throw them both into the deep end of the pool. Shane is arrested for domestic terrorism, and Chloe is abducted by Shane's followers, and nobody knows that they're a couple. So
oh, wow.
The unintended consequence of, I've jeopardized the person I love through this hobby, obsession, whatever you want to call it, I thought was a pretty powerful setup. So that's sort of the inspiration for the second novel.
Whew. That's shot out of the cannon. That's
shot out of the cannon.
Let's go.
Yeah. It's most of the book, as I mentioned, there's sort of this alternating narrative between Shane and Chloe from their respective captivities. And you fill in the backstory, sort of dropped as the publishing world would call it, in medias res. So you're, into the middle of the action. Mm-hmm. And then there's this third narrator, Wayne, who has voluntarily offered to be Shane's defense attorney in the proceedings. And Wayne turns out to be sort of an interesting character because he becomes the intermediary between Chloe's abductors and Shane. And, we discover he isn't entirely altruistic himself. So, the book is, really a statement and a critique of unbridled populism that tips into oftentimes online extremism or real world extremism. the limits of, free speech, hate speech, et cetera. And, really the sort of self-fulfilling toxic internet subcultures that can, rise up, there's this echo chamber effect that you see online all the time, from legitimate social networks to, dark web, illegal activity, where those statements and those beliefs start to kind of get normalized. And when that collides with reality or trips into reality, I think is both a horrifying moment, but also something I really wanted to explore as an author.
No, I mean, I think it's very apropos given what's happening in the world, what's about to happen in November, as well as just the undercurrents of all that. I'm curious, since it's mostly alt-right, or the movement's mostly alt-right, is there any contrast to the left culture, the progressive culture? Do they get I always find this fascinating that, to me, it seems sometimes that the alt-right and the progressive left sort of meet at the other ends of the spectrum. And it's like this dichotomy. You're like, hold on, they're anti-vax. What? Right. Hold on, mind blur. Right. Kennedy. They both like Kennedy. What's going on?
I had an 8th grade civics teacher who made that exact argument, that the extremes of the political spectrum start to look like, act like, behave like each other. And that was definitely a point of the book. In fact, it really, I hope, challenges the reader about some of their assumptions about what these things are and what these movements mean and what's behind them. I think oftentimes we too will listen to the echo chamber and self-affirming our beliefs, but then we also tend to sort of do almost the opposite to the other side, right? Regardless of where you land in the political spectrum, which is you ascribe expectations on them about what their beliefs are based on, shreds of evidence of what that person may or may not believe. So, I am deeply troubled by our political polarization and our lack of, I'll call it, leadership in the middle. It's like compromise has become a 4-letter word. I think that there are members of, again, both parties that are, I describe it as troll governance, right? They're sort of more interested in the soundbite or the provocation of the other side than they are in actually governing and make, we live in a democracy. And so by definition, compromise is part of what has to happen in a functioning democracy. And, we can't be a nation that alternates between, extremist ideologies every election. So,
yeah, no, it's a very good point. A lot of people don't talk about the lack of civility and compromise. I mean, the reason why democracy and representative government republics work is because of the tension between how it's set up, and the only way to make it function is compromise. It's set up inherently that way so that there's no tyranny, which I always thought was really interesting. When you look at the progressive left and you talk with like Antifa and, just the more militant side. Yeah. And then you get the cancel culture, and you're like, the irony is cancel culture is definitely fascist.
It's extremely intolerant of differing points of view. Right.
And it's, you have to believe, no, I don't do it, and it's interesting. I just find this so fascinating because, live in San Francisco, which is the epicenter of the progressive bubble at times, but then also there's just a feeling sometimes that people don't understand the other side. And I think that's not cool. And I'm glad you wrote a book like this, because I think it's, sometimes through fiction, we can tell truths we can't tell in nonfiction.
Yeah. Yeah. And I am a big fan of, not to spoil my endings, but I'm a big fan of flawed protagonists. I think that, that's another undercurrent to our current political discourse, where it's just sort of, we believe we're entirely righteous and that the other side is completely wrong. And there's just there seems to be less and less middle ground to even base a compromise on. So I like flawed protagonists for that exact reason, because they exhibit behaviors, beliefs that we don't always agree with. And in both Shane and Chloe, I try to show what's virtuous about them both, but I also try to show where they're hypocritical and where they're flawed. And, I hope that, you have this moment as an author where you're like, gosh, I'm less than 2 months away from the book being out in the world. I'm curious how people will react to it, and a little bit scared about how people will react to it, right? Because I think, there is an increasing sense that you have to pick a side, that even if you represent a middle ground and represent the opposing political belief system in a human way, that you're somehow acquiescing or not standing up for what you believe in, or those types of things. And a big theme in my writing and on my blog at miketrigg.com is, let's find a middle ground. I think of myself as a progressive, liberal, Democrat, but I feel it's very important to have common ground. And I seek out and maintain friendships with friends who are conservative. And I think that that's really important to do.
Oh, I agree. There's this great book I just read called The Constitution of Knowledge. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I haven't. I'll have to check that out.
It's Jonathan Rauch. Fantastic book. I mean, it's
okay.
His arguments are essentially, there's this idea of the reality-based world. And if you're in the reality-based world, you need this constitution of knowledge in order to...
I'm writing it down now.
Yeah, in order to seek the truth. Because there's a lot of people on both sides that say truth is subjective and truth is in the eye of the beholder, blah, 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 blah. And that you can never have absolute truth. That's not true. In the reality-based world, you seek truth and you prove, if you're in a reality-based discipline like science and law and journalism to a certain degree should be reality-based, right? And government should be as well, like institutions, that the pursuit of the truth and the pursuit of knowledge in support of the truth in a way that incorporates all the knowledge and being able to change your mind and being able to always have the higher good is his, he's like, this is my thesis. I think this is the right way to go.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about what you just said about, I know conservatives, I know progressives, etc. One of his arguments is diversity of opinion is more important than diversity on the way you look. And I paraphrase, and I probably got it wrong, but it's in any of these diversity things, they never talk about diversity of thought. And I think to your point, as you go through talking about what your book's about, that's the thing that splinters us away. Not the way we look, it's how we think.
Right. I really believe that thoroughly. I think that political diversity and economic diversity are two of the dimensions of diversity that get downplayed. Partly because they're harder to know, right? We can know someone's skin color or gender or other kinds of things, sort of just by looking at them. But that doesn't always tell you the full story. And I think my son is a junior in college right now. And I thought it was very admirable for the president of the university that he attends was very proactive on those dimensions. He said, we value political diversity. He's like, that's increasingly rare in academia, in college campuses that have become, frankly, very intolerant. Of course, we don't allow hate speech, everything, there are limits to this, but just because somebody has a differing point of view doesn't mean we're going to, cancel them off campus. So I thought that was refreshing to hear. And then they also have made a very concerted effort to improve their economic diversity and really consider that as a major factor in their admissions and trying to, be among the few colleges in the country that accept every student regardless of need and are able to bridge that with scholarships. And so, I think that's another major theme of the book, Burner. And in fact, the topic around which Shane and Chloe, who on the surface seem to be sort of, political opposites, the topic around which they find common ground is wealth disparity. She has guilt over her tremendous wealth. He kind of runs these schemes/scams that he sort of justifies as sort of a modern day Robin Hood. and this becomes kind of a point of not only sympathy but collaboration between them. And that aligns with my own thinking. I mean, I think you live here in San Francisco, I live in the Bay Area. We are one of the most challenging dimensions of the social fabric here is it's become very disparate wealth pool.
Yeah, it's wealth disparity.
Many of the most uber wealthy people in the world live here. And, we have a very large unhoused population here as well. And the city has become too expensive for many people to even live in. Yeah. So, you kind of see that on an everyday basis here. It's another topic and issue that I really, wring my hands over. And that's a huge theme of the book.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. It's just fascinating, after I read his book, I read another one called The End of Race Politics. And it was by Coleman Hughes, which is he's a young conservative commentator, intellectual, Black man. Actually, he's Black and Hispanic, I think. It doesn't matter, but just for context. And that was an interesting book too, because I normally don't read that kind of stuff, but I just love, you and I are about the same age. So the whole idea of like a William F. Buckley firing line, intellectual combat, like two people that were equally matched, but then had good arguments. I kind of grew up that way. And I thought, gosh, I love it when people challenge the status quo. I mean, as entrepreneurs, that's our job.
Yeah.
Like we create something from nothing, authors, something from nothing. We're challenging the status quo.
Right.
No one wants our shit. No one wants to read our shit, and no one wants our shit to succeed. It's just inherent in what we do. And yet I'm just so drawn to like the intellectual combat when people really have valid points and like well done, articulated arguments, even if they're flawed. I don't personally like, we're all flawed, right? There's things I don't like about folks that I'm just, like as an example, like Joe Biden, right? I'm liberal, so probably will vote for him. Not a big fan of how he runs things, not a big fan of, a lot of his stuff. But what him and I share and what resonates with me is that he was a widower and he lost his wife and had to, so for me, I connect with him on he probably knows how I felt when my wife died. Right.
Yeah, wow.
And so it's different, but you know what I mean? Like I may not like he's a gaffe machine and, oh my God, is he really still cognizant? The humanity in the, we
lived through that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I wish there was more I wish people were really intellectually bait and honesty. Cause I honestly think both the extreme left and the extreme right don't have any intellectual honesty. I don't see anyone with really good arguments that are stand up, you either get shouted down or you don't get invited,
Yeah. And I think that really stems from, you touched on, truth and what is truth. That's another sort of theme in the book is the erosion of truth and belief. Excellent. And what you can believe in. I sort of, my simple diagnosis is that, I think for years, the complaint on the right was that the media was left leaning and left biased and too liberal. And kind of what I saw emerge when I was again working on Capitol Hill was the rise of right-wing radio at first, and justified in part by claiming to be sort of a counterbalance to what they perceive to be the left bias of traditional media. Well, now it's referred to as lamestream media and everything else. You just, and there's entire news networks that don't even make an attempt at impartiality, don't claim to be impartial in any way, shape, or form. And that is the biggest news source for, oftentimes people on the right. I mean, there was a fascinating study of the news sources of both people on the left and people on the right, Republicans, Democrats. And it was much more concentrated in outlets like Breitbart and everything else on the right than on the left. It was still, arguably left-leaning publications, but there was more diversity of views and more sources of information. And I think that's really important. I think we need to figure out a way in our modern social media and traditional media landscape to agree on facts, to start to not just justify everything we talk about and believe based on what are op-ed pieces, and instead try to really get to, base principles. What's true, what's honest, what's factual.
And I think this is important for entrepreneurs
too.
Yeah. And
100%.
Entrepreneurs should, since we are in the reality-based world, we, don't get in the echo chamber that your silly idea is great. Get out there and talk to people, talk to customers, really push the boundary on that, because it's really important. You don't want to be fooled, right? Don't be fooled. And I think that's what I see in the polarization, as people get fooled. Like, to your point, like, there is objective truth. There is.
Yeah.
It's no, and you have to pursue it, and sometimes it changes. But if you're acting in good faith, trying to get to the real solution and trying to do the best, that you can, then that's good enough. That's what I think also entrepreneurship is striving to do, because we make the ultimate gamble.
Yeah.
Like an author's the same way. To your point, when you were talking about, how people get to react to my book, are they going to like it? And I was just thinking back to when mine came out, and I'm just like, I felt the same thing. Just like hitting my stomach.
And you feel that way when you start a company too. I mean, when that, app or website or software, SaaS software, whatever it is, I'm revealing my tech bias. It could be any product, but when that first goes out into the world, it's a nerve-wracking moment. You're getting feedback for the first time. You're validating your idea for the first time. I see a lot of entrepreneurs that wait too long, and some who, rush things out too early, but it's always important to get user feedback. And that's really the moment when the rubber hits the road. What you think and believe to some degree doesn't matter. It might help you formulate a hypothesis of what an interesting business could be, but until you road test it, you don't know if you've got a great idea or a terrible idea. So
For sure. So, we mentioned at the beginning that you do a little angel investing.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot. Little.
No, a little. Don't oversell me.
Man, entrepreneur, author, and angel investor. Wow, this is so awesome. So how do you go about making those decisions? What's sort of the criteria? How do you think about it? I mean, I've interviewed other VCs on the show, and it's generally, if you're with a VC fund, it's like, okay, everyone's piling on AI. I'm going to go do AI. Everyone was piling on Web3. I'm going to do NFT. Bitcoin or whatever. So what's your general kind of thesis? How do you think about it?
I like things that I sort of have this, like, can you explain it to your parents test? A business should be simple enough in terms of what's the product, who's going to pay for it, how are you going to make money, that pick either parents or, a third grader, right? Pick whatever end of the spectrum. I get really nervous when I hear a buzzword soup, because at best that's technology looking for a solution. If companies don't understand who is going to be buying their product, it's a disaster waiting to happen. And I've been at companies like that, I've been a co-founder of companies like that, where we thought we had a cool tech. We had ideas for where we could apply the technology, what the target market would be, but we just never could lean into, that choice. And because we didn't start with that target buyer in mind, the product didn't really fully solve the needs of any buyer. And so if you're trying to sell something to everybody, you're probably selling it effectively to nobody.
Yep.
And so those kind of business make me nervous. And you touched on AI. Clearly there's a investment frenzy around AI right now. I think the candid hope by many investors who are sort of jumping in without knowing what the businesses are even doing is that the talent pool of really good AI machine learning engineers is so small that they will invest in these companies just, with the hope that maybe they get acqui-hired into some other entity, and they get dibs on an investment in something that does start to take real shape and real form. But there are a lot of those AI investments that are going to be written down to zero, at some point. So
Totally. Yeah, I'm with you. It's the Wild West out there now. It feels sort of like the information superhighway.
it does. And this is sort of the beauty of the venture-backed tech ecosystem, right? Is that money will flood into it, right? If there's a intriguing idea and we think it's going to be game changing, rather than commissioning some government project that goes for years and spends taxpayer dollars, we have money sort of flood into the space from private equity investors, and they take huge risk, and 1,000 pieces of spaghetti are thrown against the wall and one or two stick, and those one or two are, Google or a Facebook or the next whatever. I mean, that's really the challenge and the promise of the venture-backed industry. So, my other rule in investing, most of what I do is friends and family type stuff. These are people that I know personally or have worked with in the past. I don't really have a shingle out to, get unsolicited pitches, but I, work with a couple of venture funds, and sometimes there'll be, opportunities to invest alongside institutional investors. Some of these are again, just people I know that I think are pursuing an interesting idea and getting some early traction, and, putting some money in to support them as much as to make money off that investment.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's always about people.
Did I lose you?
I've found ideas are, it's like, can these people actually make something happen? And they're going to zig and zag. Yeah. That's super cool. Well, Mike, appreciate your time. This has been such a great conversation. Good luck with the book. Comes out in April, I think. Love what you're doing.
Available for pre-order everywhere now.
Yeah.
Amazon and your local
bookshop.
bookstore.
Yes.
Bookshop. Yep. You choose your vendor of choice, but Burner comes out April 16th. So
wow.
And I'll be doing some events around the country, some bookstore events and things like that.
Oh, cool. So, let me know when you're going to be doing some in the Bay Area. I'd love to go down and take a look. I love those things.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun.
Having done a couple of them, you're just like, oh, wow, people come out and they want to hear me talk about this thing I wrote.
There's nothing more satisfying as an author than talking to somebody who, read your book and I always am quick to say, hey, whether you loved it or hated it, I wanted to have a reaction, I mean, I think that's the most precious thing as an author is, takes an investment of time to read a book. How many books do you read in a year? Like the average person doesn't read too many. So if one of my books is one of those, then I'm honored.
Pretty cool. Yeah, I'm honored too. But yeah, thanks again. Good luck, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jarie.
Thanks for listening to the Entrepreneur Ethos Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it. My hope is that you learned something that can make you a little bit better. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do share it with friends and review it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also join my email list by visiting theentrepreneurethos.com to get my thoughts on what I'm doing to get better, as well as what I'm working on. You can also pick up my book, The Entrepreneur Ethos, if you want to learn the traits, values, and beliefs that I think we need to build a more ethical, inclusive, and resilient entrepreneur and, frankly, world community. Feel free to follow me on Twitter @TheDailyMBA and let me know if you have any questions or recommendations for a guest you'd like me to talk to. Also, drop me a note if you try anything we talked about on this or any other episode. I'd love to hear what's working for you. Until next time, keep getting better.